On November 18, 2025, 2 days before the Federal High Court delivered its judgment, 44 serving members of the House of Representatives signed a 2-page letter to President Bola Tinubu. They were not all from the Southeast. They were not all from one party. They included names like Honorable Mushiru Lukman alongside Southeast lawmakers, a cross-regional, cross-party coalition operating under the banner Concerned Federal Lawmakers for National Unity and Stability. Tinubu did not respond. 2 days later, Justice James Omotosho sentenced Nnamdi Kanu to life imprisonment, plus an additional 20 years on one count and 5 years on another to run concurrently. Kanu now sits in the Sokoto Correctional Center, 1,200 kilometers from his people in the southeast. Everyone is talking about whether Kanu is guilty or innocent, but nobody is asking this. When 44 of the president's own lawmakers openly challenge his handling of a national security case in writing before a verdict, and he says nothing, what exactly is the president calculating? That question is the one this video is going to answer, and the answer involves 2027, a constitutional power that has never been used in this specific context, and a fracture inside the National Assembly that is bigger than anyone is publicly admitting. Before we go any further, if you're new here, Naija Insider Report exists for one reason: to bring you the political stories that mainstream Nigerian media buries, waters down, or simply won't touch. Hit subscribe right now and stay with me, because what I'm about to show you in the next 30 minutes changes how you see everything that is happening in this country. On November 18, 2025, the 44 lawmaker coalition submitted a formal 2-page written resolution to Aso Rock. The document invoked the federal government's own precedent of negotiating with militant groups in the Niger Delta and Middle Belt and asked, if you negotiated with them, why is the Southeast different? This was not a press statement. It was a documented institutional act addressed directly to the president. The coalition was convened by Honorable Ikenga Uguchinyere, a first-time lawmaker from Imo State, described in published reports as having a track record of building cross-party legislative coalitions. His involvement signals this was not an ethnic caucus move, it was a deliberate political architecture. The letter arrived the same morning the court was days from verdict. The timing was not coincidental, it was a political deadline. Act before the verdict and the political solution remains available. Wait afterwards and you inherit a life sentence with no exit except executive pardon. Tinubu did not act. The sentence landed, and now the only path available is the one that is constitutionally more politically costly.
Nnamdi Kanu was first arrested in October 2015 under the Buhari administration. He fled after the alleged military invasion of his Abia state home during Operation Python Dance 2 in September 2017. He was controversially rearrested in Kenya and extradited to Nigeria in June 2021. The Court of Appeal discharged him of terrorism charges in October 2022, ruling that the extradition violated international law, before the Supreme Court reversed that discharge in 2023, ordering a retrial. Here is what most people missed. A separate group, not 44 but 50 lawmakers, wrote a similar letter to Tinubu as far back as June 2024, invoking Section 174 of the Constitution and Section 107 of the Administration of Criminal Justice Act. That letter also went unanswered. So this is not a new appeal. It is the third wave of documented legislative pressure, and it has been ignored every time. But here is what nobody is telling you yet, and it starts with the word pardon. The Federal High Court, Abuja, presided by Justice James Omotosho, the fourth judge assigned to this case, the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation, Lateef Fagbemi, the Presidency, the House of Representatives, the Court of Appeal, Abuja, where Kanu's 22-ground appeal filed February 4, 2026, now sits, and the Department of State Services, which held Kanu before his transfer to Sokoto. Section 175, subsection 1 of the 1999 Constitution as amended grants the President power to grant pardon to any person convicted of any offense created by an act of the National Assembly. Section 174, subsection 1 grants the Attorney General power to institute, take over, or discontinue criminal proceedings. The lawmakers' letter specifically invoked both provisions, meaning they were not asking Tinubu to violate the law. They were asking him to use powers the Constitution explicitly gave him. Nnamdi Kanu was first arrested in October 2015 under the Buhari administration. He fled after the alleged military invasion of his Abia state home during Operation Python Dance 2 in September 2017. He was controversially rearrested in Kenya and extradited to Nigeria in June 2021. The Court of Appeal discharged him of terrorism charges in October 2022, ruling that the extradition violated international law, before the Supreme Court reversed that discharge in 2023, ordering a retrial. Here is what most people missed. A separate group, not 44 but 50 lawmakers, wrote a similar letter to Tinubu as far back as June 2024, invoking Section 174 of the Constitution and Section 107 of the Administration of Criminal Justice Act. That letter also went unanswered. So this is not a new appeal. It is the third wave of documented legislative pressure, and it has been ignored every time. But here is what nobody is telling you yet, and it starts with the word pardon. The Federal High Court, Abuja, presided by Justice James Omotosho, the fourth judge assigned to this case, the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation, Lateef Fagbemi, the Presidency, the House of Representatives, the Court of Appeal, Abuja, where Kanu's 22-ground appeal filed February 4, 2026, now sits, and the Department of State Services, which held Kanu before his transfer to Sokoto. Section 175, subsection 1 of the 1999 Constitution as amended grants the President power to grant pardon to any person convicted of any offense created by an act of the National Assembly. Section 174, subsection 1 grants the Attorney General power to institute, take over, or discontinue criminal proceedings. The lawmakers' letter specifically invoked both provisions, meaning they were not asking Tinubu to violate the law. They were asking him to use powers the Constitution explicitly gave him. The tension is between Section 36, right to fair hearing, and the executive's prosecutorial discretion. A human rights lawyer, Christopher Chidera, argued in a documented November 2025 public statement that Kanu was convicted under laws that were repealed, citing Section 36, subsection 12 of the Constitution, which prohibits conviction under a law not in force at the time of the alleged offense. Kanu himself raised the repealed law argument throughout the trial. The trial court refused to take judicial notice of the repeal, which, according to Chidera, Section 122 of the Evidence Act makes mandatory. This is not a fringe argument. It is now ground one of Kanu's 22-ground appeal. Precedent. In 2022, the same Court of Appeal that will now hear Kanu's current appeal discharged him on the basis that his extradition from Kenya violated international law. The Supreme Court later reversed that. So we have a case where the highest courts have disagreed on the foundational legality of the prosecution itself, and a life sentence has now been built on that contested foundation. The AGF has constitutional authority to discontinue, but has not used it. The President has pardon authority, but has not used it. What is being used instead is inertia. And in Nigerian constitutional law, executive inertia is itself a political decision. Hold that thought, because in a few minutes, I will show you exactly who is positioned to benefit from keeping this case alive rather than resolving it politically. And the answer will surprise you, because it is not who you think. The federal government has a security narrative investment in this outcome. A conviction with a life sentence, if upheld, is presented as proof that the state can prosecute terrorism successfully. The Ministry of Justice and the AGF's office have staked institutional credibility on this outcome. Walking it back via pardon costs political capital with the security establishment and potentially with northern constituencies that have borne the brunt of IPOB-linked sit-at-home enforcement and attacks. Southeast lawmakers, both ACP and opposition, are publicly on record demanding clemency. Their political leverage in Abuja depends on being seen to deliver for their constituents. If Tinubu continues to stall, their 2027 candidacies are undermined. Kanu's lawyer, Aloy Ijimako, stated publicly in April 2026, quote, "Southeast politicians aspiring to contest 2027 elections should bear this in mind. If Mazi Nnamdi Kanu is not freed in the near term, it will ruin your chances." End quote. That is not rhetoric. It is a documented political threat with a named sender and a specific audience. The Southeast, once Nigeria's commercial engine for small and medium enterprise, has experienced documented economic disruption since the sit-at-home orders intensified from 2021. Markets in Aba, Onitsha, and Enugu have operated under a compressed trading week. Business owners have relocated assets. That is not just a humanitarian concern, it affects federal tax receipts, VAT remittances, and the commercial banking sector's non-performing loan ratios in those states. A pardon that restores economic normalcy is not altruism, it is fiscal policy. The Ohanaeze Deputy President-General, Okechukwu Isigudzoro, stated in a January 2026 interview with Punch newspaper, quote, "A pardon for Nnamdi Kanu before 2027, preferably on June 12 or October 1st, will change the political temperature in the Southeast and deny the opposition a powerful mobilization tool." End quote. June 12 is Democracy Day. October 1st is Independence Day. The suggestion is that Tinubu should weaponize a pardon symbolically, which means the pardon, if it comes, will not be justice, it will be transaction. The presidency has made no documented public response to any of the 3 rounds of legislative letters. The AGF Fagbemi has maintained prosecutorial continuity. But behind the scenes, published reports indicate that Governor Alex Otti of Abia State, a man who campaigned partly on restoring peace to the Southeast, has acknowledged exploring strategies for Kanu's release. His political positioning makes him a potential back channel. The coalition of 44 lawmakers was explicitly cross-party: ACP, PDP, Labour Party. This is significant because it means Tinubu's own party members are among those pushing him publicly. An ACP lawmaker co-signing a letter that implies presidential inaction is inadequate is a documented crack in legislative support. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is just the Southeast playing ethnic politics. But look at what happened in the Niger Delta between 2006 and 2009. The same government that prosecuted militants eventually offered a general amnesty. The same institutions, the same constitutional powers. The result was a decade of relative peace in the oil sector, and oil revenues stabilized. This is not a new playbook. The only question is who benefits from delaying it this time. Right, pause here for 1 second. If what I've just broken down is new information for you, drop a comment below and tell me, did you know any of this before today? I want to see your reaction, because in the next section, I'm going to show you something that makes everything I just said even more significant. Don't go anywhere. The answer to who benefits from keeping this case unresolved is those within the northern political establishment who see a politically weakened Southeast as strategically useful heading into 2027. A region consumed by internal security, economic disruption, and a jailed symbol has less bandwidth for opposition coalition building. That is the calculation. The Southeast contributes significantly to Nigeria's informal economy. Aba is a major manufacturing hub. Onitsha hosts one of the largest open markets in West Africa, and Enugu is a growing service economy center.
The sit-at-home orders enforced by armed groups since 2021 have compressed the trading calendar by an estimated 1 working day per week. Over 3 years, that compounds. Foreign investors who might consider southeastern Nigeria for manufacturing or logistics are waiting for stability signals that have not come. The conviction, without a political resolution pathway, risks consolidating rather than dismantling armed splinter groups operating under the IPOB umbrella. Documented attacks on security personnel and civilians in the southeast did not cease during the trial, they continued. A life sentence with no political exit creates a martyrdom dynamic that is strategically counterproductive for the Nigerian state. The fact that northern lawmakers co-signed the November 2025 letter is the most underreported element of this story. It means the Kanu question has crossed a threshold. It is no longer purely a southeast concern. When a lawmaker from the north co-signs a letter asking a president from the southwest to politically resolve the detention of an eastern separatist leader, something has shifted in the architecture of Nigerian political calculation. For a trader in Aba who cannot open her shop on Mondays, for a student in Enugu who has missed days of school during enforcement, for a transporter in Onitsha whose trucks cannot move, the Kanu case is not political theory. It is the structure of their week, the safety of their route, and the viability of their livelihood. And this is where it gets international, because what is happening inside Nigeria right now is being watched very carefully from outside, and the watching is not passive. Here is why that matters. The lawmaker's letter specifically referenced international tribunal pronouncements in Kanu's favor. This refers in part to the ECOWAS Community Court of Justice, which has previously found Nigerian government conduct in detention cases to violate international human rights norms. If Kanu's appeal reaches a stage where international bodies are engaged, Nigeria's posture before bodies like the UN Human Rights Committee or ECOWAS Court becomes a diplomatic liability at a time when Tinubu is positioning Nigeria for continental leadership through the AU and ECOWAS. Kanu is a British citizen. The UK government has previously engaged the Nigerian government on his case through diplomatic channels. Post-conviction, that engagement is likely to intensify. For a Tinubu administration that has publicly pursued closer UK economic relations and is negotiating with British institutions on investment and diaspora remittances, continued UK government concern about a life sentence for a British Nigerian citizen carries bilateral friction. Nigerians in the UK, US, Canada, and across Europe who send remittances, a documented $20+ billion annual flow, are disproportionately from southeast Nigeria. The emotional temperature of the diaspora is a real variable. Nigerians in the UK who might otherwise support or stay neutral on a Tinubu second term are watching whether the president can resolve a case that symbolizes for millions of Igbo people the question of belonging to the Nigerian project. This pattern, where a sitting government uses criminal prosecution to contain a separatist movement, then faces political pressure to use executive clemency as a peace instrument, is documented internationally. Comparable instruments were used in the Good Friday Agreement process in Northern Ireland and in South Africa's post-apartheid amnesty architecture. The lesson from both: criminal prosecution alone does not resolve political identity grievances. Political process does. In Kenya in 2008, after the post-election violence that killed more than 1,000 people, the government and opposition were forced into a power-sharing arrangement under international pressure. The trigger was not the violence itself, it was the political cost of inaction. Nigeria is not Kenya in 2008, but the structural dynamic is recognizable. A government holding a symbolic prisoner while a region burns, and an international community waiting to see whether statesmanship or stubbornness wins. The strongest argument for letting the conviction stand is this: the Nigerian state spent a decade prosecuting this case through multiple courts, survived an appellate discharge, returned to trial, and produced a verdict supported by documented evidence of broadcasts inciting violence against security forces.
To pardon Nnamdi Kanu is to signal to every armed group in Nigeria that sustained agitation is eventually rewarded. That signal has direct implications for the Middle Belt, the Niger Delta, and the Northwest, regions with their own active grievances and armed actors. This is not a frivolous argument. It is the argument the security and justice establishment is making internally. The problem with that argument is that it has already been partially undermined by the federal government's own conduct, because the same government has negotiated amnesty and engaged in political dialogue with groups whose documented violence exceeded anything attributable to Kanu's broadcasts. The asymmetry is the argument. Not that Kanu is innocent, the court found otherwise, but that the treatment of this case is politically inconsistent with how Nigeria has handled comparable situations. That inconsistency is what 44 lawmakers in writing put on record. Lines from the middle ground. The lawmakers are just doing ethnic solidarity. Factually false. The 44-person coalition was documented as cross-regional and cross-party, including a named northern lawmaker. Ethnic solidarity does not explain Honorable Muchiru Lukman's signature. Tinubu can't pardon because Kanu was convicted of terrorism. Factually incorrect. Section 175 of the Constitution does not exclude terrorism offenses from the presidential pardon power. The pardon power is constitutionally unconditional. IPOB will stop the sit-at-home if Kanu is released. This is uncertain, not settled. IPOB itself has publicly rejected the framing that Kanu's release is a political favor to be negotiated. Emma Powerful, IPOB's spokesperson, explicitly condemned appeals made in that transactional framing. Any political resolution will need to engage what IPOB says it actually wants, which is more complex than a single release. Back to the central question from the hook. What is Tinubu calculating by staying silent? The answer is that he is in a political triangle. Act now and you antagonize the security establishment and risk northern political backlash. Act later, on your timeline, before June 12 or October 1, 2027, and you convert a legal outcome into a political asset. Do nothing, and you let the Southeast simmer while your lawmakers go on record as more responsive than you are. That is the calculation. Whether you voted for this government or opposed it, every Nigerian needs to understand that the Kanu case is no longer about Kanu. It is about what kind of country Nigeria decides it wants to be before its next election. 3 most likely next moves. 1. The appeal plays out. Kanu's 22-ground appeal at the Court of Appeal, filed February 4, 2026, will take months to be heard. The most substantively strong grounds involve the repealed law argument and the denial of allocutus before sentencing. If the Court of Appeal finds merit on either, the government faces either a retrial or a reduced sentence, not an acquittal. This path gives Tinubu cover to wait. 2. A timed pardon. If the political cost calculation tips before 2027, a presidential pardon under Section 175 is the fastest resolution mechanism available. The Ohanaeze calculation suggests this would most effectively land on June 12, Democracy Day, or October 1, Independence Day, 2026 or 2027, for maximum symbolic and electoral effect.
The 44-person coalition has a third phase available to it, a formal legislative resolution or motion on the floor of the House. If that happens, Tinubu's non-response becomes a matter of parliamentary record, not just a private letter. That raises the political costs significantly. Whether the Court of Appeal schedules a hearing date for the 22-ground appeal, whether the Attorney General makes any public statement on prosecutorial discretion, whether any APC gubernatorial candidate in the Southeast formally links their 2027 campaign to the Kanu question, whether the UK Foreign Office issues any formal statement post-conviction. The appeal drags into 2027. The Southeast becomes a low-intensity conflict zone with sustained economic disruption. Voter apathy in the region suppresses the APC's potential margin.
A competitive presidential candidate from the PDP or Labour Party uses the unresolved Kanu case as a mobilization anchor. Tinubu loses the Southeast entirely, and the election becomes structurally competitive. This is not certain, but it is documented as a risk within voices within the Tinubu support base. A political pardon is framed as a humanitarian act of statesmanship rather than political transaction. It is paired with an inclusive security dialogue involving Southeast civil society, state governors, and the federal government. IPOB splinter groups are brought into a verifiable disarmament process. Economic investment in the Southeast resumes. This scenario requires Tinubu to absorb short-term political cost for long-term national stability, which is the definition of leadership. Demand that their representatives in the House state their position on the legislative record. Watch the Court of Appeal proceedings on the Kanu appeal. Hold both the government and IPOB to account because neither is entirely clean in this story. What is Tinubu calculating? The answer is time arbitrage. He is betting that the legal process will absorb political pressure long enough for him to convert a pardon, if he grants it, into a 2027 electoral asset rather than a constitutional concession. Whether that calculation is correct depends entirely on how fast the Court of Appeal moves, how much more economic damage the Southeast absorbs, and whether the cross-regional legislative coalition grows. 44 lawmakers, North and South, APC and opposition, put a 2-page letter on presidential record. The conviction stands. The appeal has been filed. Section 175 exists. The only actor with the power to resolve this on any timeline of his choosing is the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. What he does with that power before 2027 will define not just his electoral prospects, it will define the limits and reach of Nigerian statesmanship for this generation. We do not know whether any back-channel communication between Aso Rock and Kanu's legal team is ongoing. We do not know what the Court of Appeal will find on the repealed law argument. We do not know whether the 44 lawmaker coalition has a third escalation planned. When any of those become clear, we will be back here with a follow-up. I want to hear from you, especially if you think I've missed something, overstated the 2027 dimension, or gotten the constitutional analysis wrong. That conversation is the point. If this analysis gave you something the evening news couldn't, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening in this country. Like this video, subscribe to Ninja Insider Report, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. I will see you in the next one, and trust me, what we are covering next is one you don't want to miss.